This is the history of spaceflight and space technology. I'm Andy Chaikin. This is week 5, later Gemini missions and Apollo 1. Well, by the beginning of 1966, Gemini had certainly racked up an impressive list of accomplishments, spacewalking, long-duration flights, and of course, the first space rendezvous. And so by the Gemini 8 mission, things were getting even more ambitious. The Gemini 8 flight was more complex than anything that had come before. And you can see up on the right, the mission patch shows the starlight from the stars of the Gemini constellation, Castor and Pollux, being split into a spectrum to symbolize the spectrum of tasks on this flight. The crew was Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott, both space rookies. And one of the exciting goals was for Scott to perform a 2-hour spacewalk using a special backpack filled with compressed nitrogen that would be used to power a maneuvering gun, much like the one Ed White had used on Gemini 4, and fly around at the end of a very long tether and so forth. And he was looking forward to spending 2 hours outside and being the first guy, as he said, to walk around the world. But of course, the most important objective of the flight was to conduct the first space docking. For that, NASA launched an Agena target rocket on March 16th, 1966. You see it there on the left, lifting off the pad. And shortly after that, on the same day, Armstrong and Scott lifted off in their Gemini Titan and headed for orbit and to conduct their own rendezvous, chasing down the Agena and then the subsequent docking. Well, the docking went beautifully. In fact, the flying part of it was even easier than Armstrong had expected, particularly the last phase of the rendezvous and docking, where he was flying in formation with the Agena and then pulling up to it so that the nose of the Gemini fit into the docking collar on the Agena. That all went perfectly. The problems came about a half an hour later. Scott and Armstrong were out of radio contact with any of the ground stations, and Scott looked at the instrument panel and noticed that the attitude indicator showed them in a kind of a bank 30 degrees away from vertical, and this was not according to the flight plan. And he pointed it out to Armstrong, and suddenly the astronauts noticed, looking through the windows, that they were actually beginning to spin around their long axis. In other words, they were in a roll motion, and this began to pick up speed. Well, there had been some suspicions about the attitude control system on the Agena, which had its own orientation rockets, its own control system. And in fact, there had even been some indications before the docking that maybe the attitude control system on the Agena was not up to snuff. So understandably, and without any guidance from Mission Control, they assumed the problem was with the Agena. Actually, the guys in Mission Control would have come to the same conclusion, as it turns out. But so they decided, Armstrong and Scott decided, that they would undock from the Agena, and that's what they did. And let's roll the film and we'll see what happens next. Here they are approaching the Agena before the docking. And now you can see Armstrong bringing the nose of the Gemini in towards the Agena. It's faster than real time. Now you start to see that spin. And you see that the sunlight is flashing past the windows and it's getting faster and faster. Armstrong tries to stop the spin with a few bursts from the controllers, the thrusters, but it doesn't work. Now he's undocking from the Agena, pulling away sharply, and the spin gets even faster. In fact, it got so fast that they were spinning a full revolution, that is 360 degrees every second. They were in danger of passing out, blacking out, and indeed they were already getting tunnel vision. Armstrong was struggling to stop the spin using the normal orientation thrusters on the adapter section of the Gemini, and they weren't working. They weren't doing the job. And so he realized his only option was to activate a separate set of thrusters in the nose of the Gemini, which were normally reserved for controlling the craft during re-entry. That worked, but the consequence of that, the mission rules required that if you activated those thrusters, you had to come down at the next opportunity. So Armstrong and Scott carried out their re-entry, splashed down in the Pacific. They were picked up by the destroyer USS Leonard Mason, and they were in good shape, but of course they were very dejected at having to have aborted their mission, not being able to carry out all those other objectives, particularly Dave Scott's spacewalk. But, you know, the good news was they did come back alive, and they could fix the problems for future missions so that it wouldn't happen again. And so the Gemini program continued. Now, by the time Gemini 8 even flew, there had been a tragedy in the Gemini program. In February of 1966, the prime crew of Gemini 9, Charlie Bassett and Elliot C., you can see them there in the front row of this picture, they were flying their T-38 jet, which the astronauts used to travel back and forth between NASA and all of the aerospace contractors that they were dealing with. They were flying into St. Louis to land at the McDonnell Douglas plant where their Gemini spacecraft was being assembled, and there was a blinding snowstorm, and without any visibility they struck the roof of the building and they were killed. At that point, NASA conducted an accident investigation. Of course, the astronaut corps mourned the loss of C. and Bassett, and Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan, you see them here in the back row, they were the backup crew for Gemini 9. They now became the prime crew. And, you know, they had to just put the tragedy behind them and move on with the program. But consider this. If Armstrong and Scott had not made it back alive, and that disaster had happened within a few weeks after this tragedy of Bassett and C being killed, if you'd had that double tragedy, that would have dealt potentially a death blow to the space program. And the fact that that they did get back, that Armstrong and Scott did get back, meant that they could continue, but otherwise the consequences could have been terribly severe. And as we will see, there was yet another tragedy lurking on the horizon.